do you think the South Korean government is capable of coming up with strategic nuclear weapon?
Well, there's no question in my mind that South Korea has the technical capabilities, that is the science, the engineering, to be able to build the bomb. And that's what President Yoon also said. With their technical capabilities, they could do so reasonably quickly. Well, the South Koreans certainly could do so. It turns out, for a variety of reasons, they can't do so very quickly because to build a bomb takes essentially three things. You have to have the bomb fuel, the nuclear fuel. So that's either plutonium or highly enriched uranium. And right now, South Korea has neither because of the nuclear civilian program that the Americans have assisted the South Koreans on, that has stipulated in the agreement that that the South Koreans, in this case, would not do those parts of the operation that would give them capability to make plutonium or highly enriched uranium. So they don't have that. And because of that, it actually takes longer than what people think or what they say. You also then, you have to do the weaponization, the second part, and that is you have to design, build, and test the nuclear weapon. There's no question the South Koreans could design a nuclear weapon. Now, the testing would be interesting. You know, I would imagine that none of the provinces in South Korea would volunteer their space for doing an underground nuclear test. So I think that would give them second thoughts. But the South Korean can do it. The third part is delivery, missiles or rockets. And yes, of course, South Korea can do that. It would take some time, some adjustment to do so. So that's the way one typically has looked at. Could South Korea build a bomb? The answer is yes. But in this case, it's much more difficult than building a bomb because North Korea, which is the adversary, has not only built the bomb, you know, they now have a good 30 years of experience. They've done 6 nuclear tests. They've done hundreds of missile tests. They've done all of this for all of these years. And so what South Korea, if it's going to have its own indigenous nuclear arsenal and deterrent, it has to match up to the North Koreans. And that would take much more than 6 months, 12 months, or a year or two. And it's also a commitment that South Korea would have to make essentially forever, you know, with the North Koreans, to go step for step whenever the North Koreans, suppose North Koreans then put one on a submarine. And so then South Korea has to worry about what does it do with submarine, you know, launched nuclear weapons capability. So it would be a commitment that would take a substantial fraction of South Korea's military budget to do so. And I think that's the part that's generally not appreciated. So it wouldn't be as simple as just, can they build a bomb? Of course South Korea can build a bomb. Can it field an effective deterrent to North Korea? That would be a major and costly undertaking.
You also briefly mentioned about the international pressure that if South Korea is determined to do so, they have to go through the NPT and also nuclear umbrella from USA, the people in Washington, and also they have to bite the bullet when it comes to international sanctions, when it comes to trade. It'll eventually destroy Samsung and even Haiyu. Do you 100% agree to that point? So some people might say, or even people in Korea say, it's just a political gesture.
Well, so I don't know whether it's a political gesture on South Korea government's part, but the American government has to take this seriously. And as you just indicate, you know, there are several more facets to this issue besides can you build a bomb or not? And that is, what about the international and the American reaction to South Korea making that decision? The U.S. has put an enormous amount of effort into the non-proliferation regime, I'll call it, not just the treaty, but all the treaty, the agreements, the relationships, extended deterrence, and so forth. Put an enormous amount of effort. And South Korea's decision to do this indigenously would just blow all of that up. And so, yes, that would be a very tragic path for South Korea to take. Instead of being sort of the shining star, which it is now for nuclear energy, instead of being the shining star, it would now be more along the lines of a North Korea or someone else. And so, yes, that would be tragic. The U.S., in my opinion, would fight that. Of course, there are some people that would say, well, maybe the U.S. would turn a blind eye. I do not believe that. And I'm going to give you another reason why it won't turn a blind eye. Because there are two more things as to why it's a bad idea. So this whole international regime is one reason. So along with that, you completely threaten South Korea's civilian nuclear program. And so I've been to North Korea many times now, but I've also been to South Korea many times. I visited down in Daejeon. I visited down in Busan, where they have these incredible heavy industrial capabilities to forge pressure vessels, which the United States of America can no longer do. And so the Republic of Korea is building the pressure vessels for the American reactors in Georgia. So, and 25 to 30 or so % of your electricity comes from nuclear power. You don't have enough uranium in your country. Right now, you don't have the enrichment capability either to make the fuel, to enrich the fuel. You have the factories that can make the fuel once you get the enriched uranium. All of that would come apart. And so I say, why in the world would you want to trade the world's best nuclear civilian power capabilities and let that slide? And then the fourth and the most important reason, actually, for South Korea not to get its own indigenous nuclear deterrent, it's too dangerous. It's just too dangerous. Whatever you say about the nuclear umbrella and deterrence, it is the steady hand of the American government over the years of all sorts of military provocations between the South and the North, whether it's the West Sea, whether it's the sinking of the Chernan, whether it's drones coming back and forth to DMZ. Those are the sort of things where you don't want to have leaders with their fingers on the nuclear trigger pointing at each other. It helps to have something like the Americans, steady hand, lots of experience in the nuclear business, really understanding you have to stay away from going nuclear. And so my view is, if South Korea would actually go that, it would make South Korea much, much more dangerous place than it is today.
Well, I think the South Korean government and also the political leaders down there, they consider, say, outside threat or risk is getting higher, then the household must have something. For example, buying grenades from out in the street and putting in a cage or the safe in the house. Are you referring to that kind of situation? You understand the outside threat. You need to secure your family, your property, but buying a grenade or buying a semi-automatic gun in your safe is not a good idea.
Yeah, so that's a nice analogy, but in the nuclear business, it doesn't work. The nuclear part is just, it's too important. And so there, you actually have to go back and look at what's worked and what's not worked. And so South Korea is not only safer without nuclear weapons, it's much more prosperous without nuclear weapons. So would you feel better if you would be able to protect your house by yourself? I guess so. But we're talking about a country, and we're talking about a nuclear adversary. And so that's much, much more serious. And what, in my opinion, is not sufficiently understood, even though I think the Biden administration has tried very, very hard to get that message across, is what's called extended deterrence. But those kind of terms don't mean anything to the people that live in the house that are worried about somebody from the outside. I mean, what one really has to say is, look, the security of South Korea is critically important to the United States of America. So these are not questions as to whether we would trade, Seoul for San Francisco for Seoul. Seoul, Republic of Korea, is crucial to America's role in the world and to our own security. So if we look at that region of the world, you have China, you have Russia close by, and so we want South Korea as a friend, as an ally. It's not that we're doing this as a protection racket for you and you got to pay for it. We're doing this because it's important to the United States and our security. And what's critical is that our political people actually get that message across. Unfortunately, in the Trump era, that message was lost. In the current era, it's very clear the Biden administration has tried to drive home, no, this is in our own interest. That's why we're doing it. It's not just us doing you a favor.
You mentioned in your book back in 2019, which was 4 years ago, there was one of the biggest hinge point that you pointed out that the Trump administration misstepped and also got a wrong information, a wrong judgment. Why is that? And also adding to that, what should have been done?
Well, I explain it in great detail in the book. And again, it's really important to look at the details and the back and forth between North and South Korea. But let me just try to summarize it. Actually, the 2019 going into Hanoi, both sides made tragic mistakes, both North Korea and the United States. And by the way, throughout the whole book, I'm not just a North Korean sympathizer. I mean, I just tell it the way that it is. And again, from my point of view. So the mistake that the North Koreans made was that after the North Koreans made after the 2007 summit in Singapore, things were set up in order to make significant progress. And because that summit agreed you'd have normalization, and denuclearization. So it had both, for North Korea as well as for the United States. So that's what was crucial from 2018. Going into now, 2019, now this is where the details have to be hammered out. And the North Koreans did not do the details with Ambassador Steve Biegun, who was trying to prepare for the Hanoi summit. They were counting on the fact that Kim Jong-un himself would do that with Trump when the time comes. They didn't do the homework with Biegun, and so they were not well prepared. On the American side, this again is once where you re-enter John Bolton, and he basically prepped President Trump that he should not make a deal and step away. The rest of the details as to what was offered for what, again, I discuss it in the book, but the bottom line was right after that summit where most people were congratulating Trump that he walked away from a bad deal. I wrote an article that said, was he really right to walk away? And the answer is no. It was a mistake to walk away. We had an opportunity, not that North Korea and Kim Jong-un were going to give up the nuclear weapons the next month or even the next year, but we would go on the right trajectory to get there. That's what Hanoi should have been, and it wasn't. It was killed. He walked away. Kim Jong-un went home embarrassed. And today, when we sit here, you started this conversation with, did I see the military parade? Well, if you see what they brought out in the military parade, and since then they've restarted all of their nuclear facilities, that's where we sit today. That's the result of the walking away from Hanoi. And so that was a hinge point. It was a big hinge point. It was a big hinge point in the wrong direction. And then in addition to that, it also looks like from about February of 2022 on, that it's not so clear that Kim Jong-un is going to follow his father's and grandfather's steps and go towards normalization with the United States. Right now, it looks like it's over. And so that's what makes the situation more dangerous. The technical capabilities have increased, and politically, North Korea is not interested in diplomacy right now.
What if some of the Trump administration people, also supporters of President Trump back then, they claimed that he was trying to protect the interest of the United States at best, and that's why he walked away? Would it be viable?
So no, I disagree. And that's, again, I explained that in the book. President Bush, President Obama, President Trump. You would think that all of them were motivated by doing what's best for the United States of America. But in the cases that I lay out, they each made mistakes. So instead of doing a technically informed sort of risk-benefit analysis, for example, in the Bush administration, the centrifuge enrichment intelligence, okay? If you do a technically informed analysis of that, you say, okay, that's not good, but it's going to take them 10 years before they can build a uranium bomb. And if we walk away from this agreed framework, they're going to build a bomb in 6 months. That's the sort of trade-off. But that's not how the decisions were made. They were made politically. And then in the Trump situation, it was exactly the same. If you actually looked at saying that Kim Jong-un actually was going to open Yangbyon up for the U.S. and for international inspectors to shut it down, to shut down all of Yangbyon, that wouldn't have ended their nuclear weapons program, but it would have slowed it down substantially, and it would have kept Americans and North Koreans engaged instead of letting them go the way it has. And so no matter what anybody says, they have to account for the fact that today things are worse than they were in 2019.
Now, also in your book, again, you mentioned the ultimate goal of your own and also the scientists and engineers outside is to securing peace in the international society. Now, what can we do as an international community to make sure that North Korea is going to be denuclearized someday later, and make sure that the Korean Peninsula is a safe place?
Well, the way that you asked that question points to the problem that we've had in the past couple of decades, is that your focus is just on denuclearizing North Korea, rather than trying to understand North Korea sufficiently to see what their concerns are. And were the Americans North Korea, where North and South could actually work together in order to bring peace to the Korean Peninsula. And to have peace, it's going to take more than just denuclearizing North Korea. So one has to understand that the nuclear situation is part of a much broader issue, and it's the broader issue that really has to be solved. And that's the way, in my opinion, it should be done. With regards to your question and your comment, about the fact that I've said in the nuclear arena, one of the things that we drive for, that I've certainly drive for, is peace, on the international scene. And particularly what I have focused on since I work mostly in the nuclear arena, having spent more than 50 years off and on associated with Los Alamos and the nuclear world, that in the nuclear world, in essence, because of the fact that nuclear power, nuclear energy, is just millions of times the energies from almost everything else, is you can do a lot of good with that. For example, nuclear electricity, which South Korea is getting now, nuclear medicine. You can do a lot of bad. And so you have to cooperate. That's why I've been to Russia. That's why I've been to China. That's why I've been to India. That's why I've been to Pakistan and all the other places. Is cooperate to get the best out of the nucleus and avoid the worst. And that takes cooperation. And that's also a possibility that could be done with North Korea. So to put it specifically in North Korea, I have made suggestions in the past that actually what we could do with North Korea is to work with them cooperatively to convert their military nuclear and missile capabilities to civilian nuclear and space capabilities. That's the sort of cooperation where you then actually wind up, North Korea gets something, we get something by reducing the risks from their military programs.
So the hinge point back in 2019 was the best moment for these two governments to come up with the best solution of what they have, but they just walked away with the wrong information.
No, it was a moment that the Americans and North Koreans should have gone in that direction to explore what can be done. Again, it was no guarantee that North Korea was going to get rid of nuclear weapons, but what we're seeing now, they've gone exactly in the opposite direction. At least it would have been a step in the right direction, and the risk was worth taking. That's what I try to say in the book.
Did you watch the military parade that took place last week?
So I did not watch it, but of course, I've seen the KCNA photos of the military parade, and some of it was actually video and photo. But no, I did actually not stay up and watch it.
Okay.
But I've seen clips.
When was the last time you put your feet in the Pyongyang airport?
So I was there every year from 2004 through 2010. So the last time was November 2010.
So that was like 13 or 12 years ago.
It was essentially 12 years ago, yeah.
Okay. So watching this televised, the military parade a week ago, does it kind of impress you or even shock you? What's your impression?
Well, it didn't shock me because I've been following North Korea ever since that first visit in 2004. And since I'm a technical person, what I have especially focused on is try to do the best technical analysis of their nuclear and their missile programs. And so, of course, what they showed in the parade is missiles, essentially. Of course, also some other military hardware, but especially in terms of nuclear related, it's the missiles and those capabilities. And we've watched those improve essentially every year, during that time frame. So it was not shocking. It was not surprising. It was just worrisome, is what I would call it, that they have just continued to enhance their capabilities.
In terms of technology and science to develop whatever they want to develop, what are they capable of in the layman's term to our viewers or readers? What are they capable of?
Well, the North Koreans have now demonstrated they know how to build a nuclear bomb. And the way they demonstrated that is with the nuclear tests. So the nuclear test is sort of the bottom line proof of what they're capable of doing. So the first nuclear test was in 2006, in October, and it didn't work so well. But nevertheless, it was a nuclear test. They got some nuclear reaction from that test. And then the next 5 tests worked just fine. And particularly the last one as of right now, which was in September 2017, was a very big nuclear explosion and most likelihood a hydrogen bomb. And so what worries me then is they clearly have demonstrated the capability that they can make a nuclear device. And then they've also shown us when they do these military parades or they do the visits of Kim Jong-un to the military missile facilities, they've tried to demonstrate that they can put a nuclear device inside of a missile. So the combination of a nuclear device inside a missile is a very dangerous situation. So the best that we can estimate, and these are still estimates at this point, is that North Korea knows how to build a nuclear device. They most likely can miniaturize that device to fit them into their what we would call the short-range and medium-range missiles. Initially, they were called Scuds and Nodongs. And with that, then what the public needs to understand is that I believe North Korea can reach all of South Korea with missiles that have a nuclear device. And most of Japan with the Nodong missiles with a nuclear device. They have demonstrated that they can build and launch what we call an ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile, which could reach the United States. So from the best that we can tell, and the reason I say the best that we can tell is because they've launched those not in a normal trajectory to go all the way to the United States. They've done what's called a lofted trajectory. Most likely the reason for that is they want to keep them close by where they can monitor them. And yet, from that lofted trajectory, you can calculate that if they would do a normal trajectory, they could reach all of the United States with a missile. However, you still have to put the nuclear warhead inside of that missile, and that's much more difficult than for the short and medium range. So my own view is I don't think they can have confidence that they could reach the United States with a nuclear-tipped ICBM. Not yet. But then with each of these parades, with each new missile launch, they get closer.
Is that the same understanding of the people in Washington?
So I think yes. Okay. Certainly if you listen to the official pronouncements in Washington, they would say something very similar. I think the military would probably go one step farther and have to say that they have the capability of reaching the United States, because the military can't take chances. They have to look at the worst case scenario. So in other words, is it possible that North Korea could put a nuclear warhead inside of one of the ICBMs and reach the United States? Is that possible? And one would say in worst case, the answer is yes. But in my opinion, they're not there yet. And so as a technical expert, I can say they still need to do more missile tests. They still need to do more nuclear tests in order to have confidence themselves that they can do so.
So the capability of North Korea when it comes to the nuclear warhead in the ICBM, if that's possible,
Then
the people
yes.
in Washington consider this as the biggest risk or threat.
Right. So obviously, yes. And the reason for that is, if you think about it today, how many countries pose that sort of threat to the United States? 3. That's it. Russia, China, and here's this little country called North Korea. And so from my standpoint, and this is what I've said all along, this is also what I've said in my book that was recently published called Hinge Points, is because of that, the United States needs to pay much more attention to the threats that North Korea poses to the United States. However, having said that, in my opinion, it already posed an unacceptable threat with the short-range missiles, because when North Korea can reach South Korea, Seoul, with a nuclear weapon, with short-range missiles, or all of South Korea, that is a threat to the United States of America, just as it is a threat to the Republic of Korea.
I see. Now, I understand you went up to North Korea and came across and have a conversation with the higher ranking officials and scientists there. In their own words, what's the purpose of the developing all this nuclear arsenal up there? What did they say? I mean, we assume what they are targeting, what they are trying to do with this, but in their words, what's the reason behind this?
Well, as you might imagine, the North Koreans are pretty disciplined. And so they have the story down quite well and well practiced. And so if you ask them that question, which of course I did, sort of the most common reply will be the hostile policies of the United States. So they're building these nuclear weapons because of the hostile policies of the United States. And then if you get into more discussions with them, they will talk about deterring and making sure that they deter the United States from attacking North Korea.
So they're still kind of possessed with all those trauma that they had experienced 70 years ago.
Well, I think not only the drama of the war, of the Korean War, but certainly, again, in my discussions, they've often mentioned what happened in Iraq, what happened in Libya. So because when I ask them, what do you mean by hostile policies? Then they say, well, you know what happened in Iraq, what happened in Libya. So as they've paid attention, and of course the North Koreans have to pay very close attention to what goes on the Korean Peninsula, what goes on around the world. And so they believe and have believed, for a long time, that the nuclear weapons, possession of nuclear weapons, will deter the Americans from military action in North Korea.
Personally, you think that's nonsense? You don't, let me put it this way. Do you kind of partially understand where this logic come from in the North Korea?
So, it's very difficult for us to put ourselves into their shoes. But yes, I can fully, it's a logical conclusion on their end. We had a Korean War, and of course they've also reminded me many times that we're still technically at war, because that was war was only stopped by an armistice and not by a treaty. So it's reasonable, for them to say On the other hand, quite frankly, some of these North Korean diplomats know the United States so well that they probably also don't believe the United States is going to go attack on North Korea. But nevertheless, that's their official policy, and it's not unreasonable. But what's also important, and this is really what I try to discuss and explain in detail in my book, is that around the time of the end of the Cold War, 1990 or so time frame, that Kim Il-sung made this strategic decision that actually he wanted to get away from a hostile relationship with the United States and to seek some sort of strategic accommodation or normalization of relationships. And what I demonstrate in the book, so for the 30 years, of early 1990s to at least recently, that was what the North Koreans were pursuing, that they had decided that it actually may be better to line up and normalize with the Americans rather than to depend on the Chinese or the Russians. And especially after the end of the Cold War, the North Koreans had reason to believe why they can't count on Russia or China anymore, because Russia and China both established relationships, including economic relationships with South Korea. And so that's what they've pursued. But what I also try to explain, and this is where in the end you really have to read the book, because I provide the detail of my discussions with the diplomats, with the technical people. You have to read the book to understand the dialogue and what I, in the end, then concluded, so that even Kim Il-sung, when he said we will try to reach normalizations through diplomacy with the United States in end of 1990 timeframe, they also then followed what I call a dual track strategy. And the dual track, what I mean by that is you do diplomacy, you pursue that seriously with the United States, but you can never really trust them. We haven't had good enough relations that we're not sure it's going to work. And so we're also going to develop the nuclear path. So in other words, move towards nuclear weapons. And we'll do the two of them simultaneously. So we'll pursue diplomacy, the nuclear track simultaneously. And what I show is that for 30 years, they pursued both. Not one or the other, but both. And which track had the upper hand, whether it was diplomacy or weapons, depended on essentially their relationship with the United States, the relationship with South Korea, the technical advances that they made or how much more they had to make. And so that's what I track through all of those times. And then at various times, it was typically when the North Koreans made some advances technically, a missile launch, a nuclear test, or something else. Then this led to a decision point. I call them hinge points, and that's the name of the book. So it led to a hinge point where then the Americans had to make a decision. And again, you have to read the book to get the idea that just one administration after another made the wrong decision at those hinge points. Those decisions were not technically informed. They were politically driven.
You were talking about this two-track approach in your book. Does that imply that they never gave up developing nuclear arsenal, even in the Keto period?
That is correct. That is correct. And
maybe they slow it down, but they never gave up.
Okay, so you just said it exactly right. So what they did is they would slow it down during diplomatic times, as long as they're making some progress. Slow it down, but don't go all the way to getting rid of it. So keep a hedge. And again, I detail in the book was what they actually did during the agreed framework. You know, what is typically known in the news media is that during the agreed framework, while the North Koreans essentially stopped the plutonium production in their Yongbyon nuclear complex, so that's the plutonium path to the bomb, while they stopped that as part of the agreed framework, and they did, and quite frankly, they lost a lot when they stopped that complex. But as a hedge, they started to develop the uranium path, the centrifuge path to the bomb. And even while they were doing that, they were, in my opinion, they were carrying out nuclear weapons designs, nuclear weapons computation. They were doing experiments with plutonium to make sure if they eventually ever get the plutonium that they would know how to cast and how to manufacture that plutonium. They never stopped missile development and missile design. But again, during the agreed framework, at one point in 1999, they actually agreed to a testing moratorium. So when you have a missile testing moratorium, when you have that, then you slow things down. Did it stop? No, but it slowed down. And then at the hinge points, when the Americans made a decision, like in 2002, when the Americans, at the meeting in Pyongyang in October of 2002, essentially they walked away they killed the agreed framework, the Clinton-era deal. They killed the deal. When they did that, then that opened the floodgates to the North Koreans. Then they could do the plutonium path and speed up the uranium path, get back to missile testing if they wanted to. So that's the trade-off you had at each of those times when you had a decision point. And unfortunately, as I said, whether it was Bush administration, 2002, Obama administration, 2009, 2012, or Trump administration in Hanoi in 2019, they made decisions at which point each time I would have counseled from a technical standpoint is no, don't go there. You know, that's just, it's the wrong decision to make technically.
So would it be fair to say that people in Washington back in George W. Bush area, when they discontinued the keto support, would it be fair? We call them, they made the right decision because they've been cooking all this behind the curtain in North Korea?
So my view of the keto project, actually at the time when the keto decision was made with the agreed framework in 1994, it took a few years to get started, but by the time the Bush administration came in 2001, they actually had a construction project going, and keto was sort of had gotten its act together, and they were building the first light water reactor. At the time in the 1990s, I didn't think it was a good idea to build light water reactors for the North Koreans, because quite frankly, what I knew about North Korea is what are they going to do with these two big reactors? They have a grid that's like a third world country electrical grid. However, the people like Ambassador Bob Gallucci and others, the people who supported him, they understood that what the keto arrangement meant, it was going to lock the North Koreans into a long-term relationship with the Americans, of course also with South Korea and with Japan, because they were paying most of the money for the keto project. And so in the end, it turns out that definitely looking back now, but even in 2002 already, it was a colossal mistake to kill the agreed framework in the keto project. Had that project actually wound up getting a major improvement in the North Korea's electricity production, the North Koreans would have had to think twice as to whether they're really going to proceed with the uranium enrichment or not. So it was a hinge point, and it was a huge mistake.
Does it look like they have the wrong intel, or they got the right intel, but they came up with a misjudgment or the wrong decision?
So that's an interesting aspect of the North Korean project, of the North Korean nuclear project, is in that particular example, no, they did not have the wrong intel.
I see.
They had the right intel. They had the correct technical information, but they made a political decision. That political decision was based on the fact that, let's just call them the hardliners in the Bush administration, believed that North Korea should never be allowed to have a nuclear program. You cannot trust them with a nuclear program. In fact, as far as they were concerned, North Korea shouldn't exist, and we shouldn't be dealing with North Korea. And so, no, the information they got about uranium enrichment was quite good. But the Clinton administration already had that type of information also. So this wasn't totally new to the United States. The Clinton administration had the same information, and they decided at that point that they still had to wait before they really confronted the North Koreans. For the Bush administration, and this particularly John Bolton, and the reason that I mention him, because he wrote it in his book. I mean, he was waiting. That information on uranium enrichment, he said, was the hammer that allowed them to shatter the agreed framework. So they were already looking to shatter the agreed framework, and the intel only gave them the hammer to do so. So it's not that it was wrong. And then, in fact, my whole involvement in North Korea from 2004, I went as what we call track 2 or track 1.5, non-government, non-official visits. So I was never a government employee going to North Korea. But, of course, since I had spent, more than 3 decades by that time at Los Alamos, I knew everybody in the government related to the nuclear business. And so, of course, when I came back, I tried to advise the government. And so through the visits, through the incredible things that the North Koreans showed me, and it was not only facilities they showed me, it was the discussions with their technical people that was so informative. And so we had a lot of information, and we've only been surprised a few times. But for the most part, lack of intelligence has not been the problem in the U.S. government dealing with North Korea.
Let's see. You said, you reading along the book, you said about 0.5 track 2, 1. How did it work? I mean, who encouraged you to visit the place? Did they invite you? And why did it happen for almost 7 years?
So
and also you came back and you pretty much briefed at a Congress, and you let people know in Washington what is going on in Pyongyang and try to tell them something. Is it still track 2 visit, or is it more likely track 1 visit?
So it was not track 1, because I was never official government, and I always had the license to say what I wanted to say and not what my government wanted me to say. So I told it the way it was, the way that I believed it was. The more important question is, why would the North Koreans, show me all of this? And then, as you just asked, why would they invite me back? Because after the first visit, indeed, I gave this big congressional testimony to Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and I laid everything out as to what happened, in Yongbyon. And before I left Pyongyang, the last evening of my visit, it was a Friday night, I had dinner with Vice Minister Kim Gae-gwan, and he was very anxious to find out, so what did I conclude from visiting the Yongbyon nuclear facilities? So I told him. And then I said, and everything I just told you, this is what I'm going to tell the U.S. government when I get back home. And I did. And when I gave the congressional testimony, it's customary to write up a statement, and then you give them that statement because you never know how long you're going to get with senators or congressmen and women. So you do the statement to make sure you can put everything down. So the night before, I sent a copy to the North Koreans.
This was 2010.
This was in 2004.
2004.
The first visit. Okay. And so next time I came back, the North Korean diplomats told me, last time you were here, you told us what you're going to say in Congress.
Okay.
And you did that. And we respect that. And so the first time, I'll tell you in a minute why I was there, but all the other visits was that I had a very good professional relationship with the North Korean diplomats and technical people. And they learned to trust me to the point that I would describe what I saw, not necessarily what they wanted me to say, but that I would not embellish things, make things up. Whatever they showed me, I would do my interpretation. And so that's why they brought me back 7 times. The first time, quite frankly, I didn't want to go to North Korea. I'd been to Russia, to China, to all these other places. I didn't want to go to North Korea. But the way these track 2 visits, or the reason I call them track 1.5 or 1.5, is that they mean non-official, non-governmental. Well, that was true on the American side. But on the North Korean side, there is no non-official, there is no non-governmental. I mean, they're the government's people, they're official. So when you put them 2 together, 1 and 2, you get 1.5. So my colleague, Professor John Lewis from Stanford University, had actually been working with the North Koreans, had been there 8 times before the 2004 visit. And he did it just like he did with China. So when China first opened up, John Lewis was a China expert. He helped in that opening of relationships of Chinese with the Americans. And likewise, he helped with the opening of that relationship with the North Koreans. And so John Lewis was invited to come back in January of 2004. And it was a particularly important time because that hinge point that I mentioned, October 2002, Americans walked away from the agreed framework. The North Koreans responded by starting up the Yangbyon nuclear facility again, and they withdrew from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. They threw out the international inspectors, and this was now 2003. And essentially nothing happened. And so the North Koreans certainly had expected the Americans to do something. They essentially did nothing. So they invited John Lewis back in to show him a few things. And John Lewis is the person who invited me to go along because we'd known each other from past adventures that we did together. And so he invited me to go. I didn't want to go. I was sure that the U.S. government wouldn't let me go. Well, most of the government did not want me to go, but there were some key people who approved it. And then I thought for sure the North Koreans will never let me in. Here's a former director of Los Alamos National Laboratory. Why in the world would they let him into their nuclear complex? Well, they did. And the reason they did is they wanted the Americans to actually see that they have done those things that it takes to be able to build the bomb. And indeed, in the end, that was the conclusion.